fact, the latest release by Newland is an album by Kenny Dorham, and that is This Is the Moment Kenny Dorham Sings and Plays. So just a little bit about this album in terms of how it came together. So the original mono analog tapes were sourced from Craft Recordings and licensed by Newland for this release. Kevin Gray did the mastering. It was pressed at Palace on 180 gram vinyl, and it's a high quality matte reverse board jacket. So let's talk about this in this video. Let's talk about how this album came about, how it sounds, maybe a word about how it compares to the original. Before we get into it, as always, hit the subscribe button so you get notified whenever I post a new video. And you can head over to Instagram and follow me if you'd like as well. Post there almost daily, featuring really a different album from my collection pretty much every day. Not video format, but text, usually discussing a bit about the history, like I do here, a little bit about the history, but in kind of easy 2-paragraph bite-sized formats. Anyway, my Instagram handle is what_can_brown. All right, so This Is the Moment was recorded in 1958, and it was released later that year. It's actually only ever been released in mono, in contrast to a lot of other Riverside titles, even the ones that came out around the same time. It's only been reissued on vinyl, as far as I can tell, just one time before, and that was in Japan in 1984. So it has been a while, and there's not many editions out there for you to get. This was actually the only time that Kenny Dorham ever sung on an album, and it's also the recording debut of Cedar Walton, which I think is kind of fun. Otherwise, in this lineup, we have Curtis Fuller, you've got Sam Jones, and then you have two drummers that trade off. You have G.T. Hogan, and then you have Charlie Persip splitting those drum duties. So I actually have a fun sort of short little anecdote about this album. So a few years ago, in fact, it was before the pandemic, so at this point it's probably about 5 years ago or so, I was at the Atlanta Record Show, and I was hanging out with a buddy who was, he was just there selling records, and he's a fellow jazz guy as well. So we're flipping through some records in one of the bins, and there's a woman standing next to us who's also flipping through some records in one of the bins. She gets to a copy of Kenny Dorham's This Is the Moment and pulls it out of the crate, and my friend, just out of pure instinct, says to her, "You're not going to like that. Kenny Dorham was not a good singer." She turns to us and says, "You know, you're talking about my father." So it was Yvette Dorham. So not a good look. We ended up having a probably a 5 or 10 minute conversation with her, asking her questions about her dad and that kind of thing. And so it ended up being fine, but it was like I said, it was not a good look. To that point, right, this album was not well received when it came out. So Downbeat, right, I've got this it's actually 1959 Downbeat compilation, even though it was put out in 1958. It was like late 1958, so they probably only got to the actual review probably early 1959. And anyway, Downbeat gave it 1.5 stars. And the reviewer called it a dreadful waste of valuable time and money. He went on to say his phrasing is stiffly monotonous. He has some intonation difficulty. His pronunciation is grotesque. He then went on to say that fortunately there are a few instrumental choruses on this LP, and Dorham shines on them, but there's a vocal on each track too, and these are discouraging to say the least. So those were the reviewer's comments at the time. So let's I want to talk about all these things, right? But let's back up just a quick second. So Kenny Dorham singing is not the most unusual thing, even though this was the only album that he did it on. If you think about the tradition of jazz musicians, and let's even actually just say trumpeters singing and playing, it almost feels like it was all but a requirement at one point. So you've got, Louis Armstrong, I think probably is the most sort of prominent example, right? But you also have Winnie Manone, you have Leon Eason, you have Louis Prima, Bunny Berrigan, Red Allen, Roy Eldridge, and of course later you had Dizzy Gillespie, you had Chet Baker, certainly Clark Terry, and I'm sure that there's others. So a number of those musicians I think that I just referenced also incorporated a lot of humor into their singing style, but Kenny Dorham was more of a serious singer, at least here. And no doubt was given the opportunity because of the massive success, really, of Chet Baker, who was also recording for Riverside at this time. It was supposedly, though, it wasn't just a marketing sort of move. In fact, I don't even believe that it was Riverside or Orrin Keepnews's idea to feature Kenny Dorham singing on this album. I think it was actually something that he wanted to do. Now, the set list here actually gives Kenny Dorham some great content, in my opinion. So you have songs like, well, songs including Autumn Leaves, From This Moment On, This Is the Moment. You've got Angel Eyes. I Remember Clifford is a especially great one, and I'll get into that in just in just a second. So, I mean, where did Dorham go wrong, right? Or did he go wrong with this release? He has a great lineup here. He has some great track choices, and there's a great tradition of trumpet players who sing. So, in my opinion, Kenny does have some great moments, especially when he's singing upper register and when singing a little bit more softly, where his tone is clear and even I would say pretty at times. His singing, I think, especially on the song "Since I Fell for You," is some of his best on the album. It's a bluesy number. He kind of keeps his range, sort of mid to upper, and it's a bit less focused on moving from note to note with words and more that he kind of does these like vocal runs. Okay, so for me in some of those moments, those types of moments is when he sounds a little bit better. Angel Eyes is another really good one for some of the same reasons in terms of keeping to a little bit more narrow of a range. But for me, the highlight overall is the track "I Remember Clifford." And even though I'm sure that Dorham chose this collection of songs, even just across the board, and probably each were personal to him for, one or variety of reasons, it feels to me like "I Remember Clifford" is maybe just a little bit more sort of genuine emotion that comes across with his singing. And maybe some of that is me overlaying that sentiment, right? Because Dorham did know Clifford Brown, and I'm quite sure respected him immensely. Um, and so there's some of that at play as well, but for me, just the intensity, I think, is best realized on that song. As far as Kenny Dorham's playing here on this album overall, it's excellent. So he has some really fantastic solos, including on the track "From This Moment On," which also features a really great solo by Cedar Walton. That might be actually the best, I think, that Kenny Dorham sounds on this album. Otherwise, his playing is also really nice on the one on the track "Since I Fell for You," both muted trumpet, by the way. So my opinion on this album overall is that while I acknowledge that Kenny Dorham wasn't as practiced of a singer, or even as sort of pretty of a singer as some were, and yes, he does have some intonation issues, um, I still think that there's merit to this album. I actually think that this one is one that grows on you with repeated listens, even if that first listen is going to be slightly jarring in terms of his delivery and some of his enunciation and that kind of thing. But also, like, listen, I'm such a fan of music history, and this is part of that history. So maybe I'm being a little bit more forgiving. You know what? It's not forgiving. It's more that I'm just like sort of inquisitive, right, about this type of release and how it came about and how it was executed and how it was received and all these things that I'm talking about in this video. Um, so in terms of, let's talk about Newland, I guess, just really briefly, because, I've been talking, I guess, about the merits of the album on its own. This was not the first album by Kenny Dorham for Riverside that Newland chose to release, right? So the first one was Jazz Contrasts from last year. Maybe I'll link to that discussion that I did, because I recorded a video on that last year. That is a better album, I think, for what it is in terms of the collection of music that's there, and Kenny Dorham does stick to the trumpet on that album. But I was still really excited for this release, especially because my copy, as with so many of these, when I try to do shootouts, my copy is not in the best shape. This is my copy. The cover, I'm sure, looks fine, but the vinyl has some feelable hairlines in it. And so, it's this new version certainly offers the best opportunity for me to hear this music sort of uninterrupted. So to that point, how does the pressing sound? Well, it was actually done very, very well, probably to no surprise, given that Newland has been doing such a great job all along. No issues whatsoever with any kind of noise, like noise floor or anything like that. It's like just super quiet. You don't hear a thing when you drop the needle until the music starts. There's no dropouts. Like there doesn't seem to be any issues whatsoever in that original master tape, which probably is. You could argue that it's expected because it hasn't had many reissues, but at the same time, like you just can't expect that these days. That something from 1958 isn't going to have any condition issues. So anyway, it's a very clean tape that they were able to represent very well in this pressing. I think that the sort of there's a nice balance to the instruments that's realized on this pressing. The piano is going to sound a little bit less distinct when the horns are playing, but that's sort of true of the Riverside sound anyway. And so I think it's something that comes across in a lot of, especially mono reissues that really anybody is tackling, right? Whether Craft Recordings is doing it themselves, or whether it's Newland, or whether it's some of these other sort of audiophile, labels that are tackling it. There's always going to be a little bit more of a what I sometimes call a vintage sound on Riverside when you compare to some of the other labels that were doing a little bit better job with their recording, like Contemporary, like Blue Note and Prestige, right? But that being said, this is still, I mean, just everything about this is an excellent sounding recording. The fact that they did it in mono, which again was the only way that this was ever released or this was ever recorded. So I guess they had to, but anyway, I just think it's nice to hear that kind of that 1958 mono original recording presented in a way that is just so extremely clean and is really, the best way that you could hope to hear the music. So that kind of sums up my thoughts. I mean, is Kenny Dorham's voice or style for everyone? No, it's not. And there's going to be people that are going to hear it and be kind of like, like I don't, I'm not as much of a fan of him. But here, listen, there's a lot of people who really don't like Chet Baker's voice either. Don't like some of those other trumpet players that I mentioned. And Kenny Dorham has his own style. And again, I think that this is the only way to hear it is on this particular album. I do think that even for those who you have to be at least willing to give it a try, I think. And like I said, I do think that it improves with repeated listens. And this is probably the most amount of times in such a short period of time that I've ever listened to this album. In fact, I'm quite sure. And what I can say is that after the first time spinning it or two, I started to pay attention a little bit more to the nuance and a little bit more to, well, also to some of his trumpet playing, which I think is just really fantastic here. So I still think that there's a lot of merit to this release, as I've said already, and I'm excited that Newland was able to put it out, because I don't know that the Craft would have done it, frankly, on their own. And I think that this is an important part of Kenny Dorham's catalog. So hope this discussion was helpful for some of you out there. And yeah, I guess that's it for me today. I'll see you next time.